This is Beyond the Big Screen podcast with your host, Steve Guerra.
Thank you for joining us today to talk about Wonder Woman from 2017. Actually, depending on when you're listening to this podcast, Wonder Woman still may be available in the theaters. We have some spoilers in this episode, but I think that by listening to this podcast, you'll have a better idea of the backstory and context of the events behind the movie. Wonder Woman is a superhero who is a part of the DC brand of comics. The 2017 version of Wonder Woman blends the comic book hero with elements of ancient Greek history and recent history. Wonder Woman is set in the background of World War I and the horrors of that war. Today, I am very happy to be joined by Kate MacDonald. Thank you so much for being on today.
It's fun. Thank you for inviting me.
Oh, my pleasure. Kate is a literary historian based in Reading in the UK. Her podcast, Why I Really Like This Book, ran for 3 years, and she has regularly been writing a bi-weekly book review on her website, katemacdonald.net, for a few years now and has moved to the area of publishing. Kate set up Handheld Press just a few months ago and is working towards the publication of the first few books. Check out the website to see what they'll be, which I'll also connect to in the show notes. Kate, maybe you can tell us a little bit more about yourself and your podcast. Is that actually still available?
Oh, yes. I'm taking a lot of care to make sure the podcasts are available for a long time. So they are, anyone can download them. And the very last one is me saying, I'm so sorry, I'm doing no more. Look at my new website for printed blogs.
Well, I definitely missed the podcast, but there's a huge back catalog so people can go and download it and have many hours of listening pleasure.
That's really nice. I really enjoyed doing them. I just gave up because the technology was beyond me. I wasn't able to record as well as I wanted to. So I thought, forget it. I can do the writing. I'll leave the technology in the drawer.
It's a lot of work, and the technology it can be overwhelming for sure.
Mm-hmm.
Just to say a few words about the production details of the movie, it was directed by Patty Jenkins, screenplay by Alan Heinberg. The movie was primarily filmed between the UK and Italy giving us the more Mediterranean flair. And at the moment, Wonder Woman has a 76% Metacritic and 92% Rotten Tomatoes. The cast, it has a really interesting full cast. Wonder Woman herself is played by Gal Gadot, an Israeli actress who I don't believe she's been in many more movies than besides playing Wonder Woman, maybe one or two other films. And then Chris Pine, who plays Captain Kirk in the new Star Trek movies. Did you notice he's enormous in the movie? He was almost unrecognizable.
Yeah, Pine it's remarkable how he's able to move from Star Trek roles to a superhero sidekick role. And he's now appearing in the new film, the novel by Madeleine L'Engle, it's a really famous American show. Madeleine L'Engle, it's like The Wind in the Door, but it isn't that. Anyway, there's a big new trailer Pine's in. So he is everywhere. He's young, teen flavoured. Is he teen flavoured? I don't know. Hero of the moment, a better way to describe it.
Then we have Robin Wright. She is primarily in the first part of the movie playing an Amazon.
But my God, she's fantastic.
Yeah. And then several other actors who would probably be recognizable to most people. Mm-hmm. But let's jump right into what is the context of this movie, Kate? What is the background and how does it begin?
Okay, well, my knowledge of Wonder Woman herself is a little imperfect. She was invented immediately after the Second World War, as far as I'm aware. But she is immortal. So she is the daughter of a god. Therefore, she lives forever. And her origins, according to this film, clearly predate the First World War. So I think we just don't have to worry about that too much. Themyscira, where she comes from, is in a timeless place. It's obviously of Earth. It's a Greek island. But it really doesn't matter when Themyscira is. And as we see in the film, humans, mortals, penetrate the bubble surrounding it. And then the goddess leaves and goes into the real world. world. And according to the news out in the last day or two from Comic-Con, the sequel to Wonder Woman will be set in the period of the Second World War. So clearly Wonder Woman, Diana, is able to move around in time, and it really doesn't matter too much.
That is interesting because I don't think many comic book heroes are immortal as such. Like, it's playing on that godlike figure of her.
Yeah, I mean, I think many comic book heroes are technically immortal, but the stories tend to be set in the present day of the readers who buy them. It's very unusual, I think, for a comic hero to go back in time and have an adventure. So what the filmmakers have done is to, for some reason, I have no idea why they chose the First World War, but clearly they thought this is a really good place for Wonder Woman to make her debut on film. It's odd. It's probably because of the centenary of the First World War itself. I can't think of another logical reason why they would choose this.
It's also kind of interesting that they've lived this idyllic male-free lifestyle. Those two probably go together quite well. They've lived that lifestyle for thousands of years, but then out of nowhere they crack through the bubble. So that kind of trope is an interesting way to start the movie.
It is interesting, but if you think about it, the bubble is cracked by an aeroplane. And aeroplanes had really not been around for very long at the time of the First World War, so perhaps this was the only possibility of breaking this mythic bubble. Before that, there simply had not been the human technology to do so. Possibly an ancient Greek, very fast sailing vessel, possibly a 19th century steam vessel. They might have done it. But thinking about it logically, it makes perfect sense that it would have to be a flying machine to crash through the bubble to allow the real world in.
To me, that was what made the movie so interesting, because I embarrassingly probably know very little about comic book heroes. And I thought that sort of mythical element to the comic book heroes could really push the plot forward in a way that you didn't really have to explain many things. You could just buy it because it was their comic book heroes.
Indeed. Yeah, you're right. The Themyscira setting demands more of the reader because the reader is expected to recognize elements of the Greek myths, is certainly expected to pick up on the fact that Ares, the god of war, is supposed to be Diana's father. So then you think back, well, what else do I know about Ares? Who were his parentage? What does that place Diana to in relation to Zeus and Juno? Or Juno, Hera. So there are many aspects of classically based education that the film requires the reader, or the viewer, to understand, to get more from that particular aspect of the film.
How well were the real life Amazons, or how much did the comic book and the movie, was it based on some sort of realistic portrayal of the Amazons?
Well, given that the Amazons were myth in the first place, I don't think realistic is the right word to use. The Amazons are known from the histories of Herodotus, who was the first historian, but he was an ancient Greek myth maker as well. Clearly, he wrote down and recorded myths and stories of his day and the common beliefs of the world around them that the people who he was among considered to be history, but could just as well have been fiction. But the myth goes that the Amazons lived in a separate land and they were a very warlike race, and they were ultimately defeated. But the unique thing about them was that they were an all-female society. And also, technically, that they cut off one of their breasts so they were able to fire their arrows more effectively. This aspect suggests a more salacious, titillating interpretation of the myth of the Amazons. I'm sure there are many other aspects to the myth. This is just the parts that I happen to know from my own reading. But because they come from classical Greek civilization, if you like, Greek studies, they would have been known to anyone who studied the classics. And in Britain, in the British context, this would have been anyone from the upper and middle classes from the 17th, 16th century onwards. So they would have been a very well-known set of characters, a very well-known trope, if you like, and it permeated much of classical literature in modern English literature. And since American literary history drew on this British this British source, the Amazons would also have come through into, I don't know, American literary history in certain ways. It's just part of it's just part of what Western literature and Western culture is based on. It's a very small element, but the Amazons are as much a part of Western culture as are the Greek gods or the Norse gods.
After the training sequence, which there's a lot of action involved in the training and conflict with their mother, a lot of classic conflict. Maybe you can tell people a little bit about the various conflicts inside of that training.
Okay, well, the most exciting part, I think, is that many of the women actors who you see on screen fighting, racing, demonstrating athletic prowess were real-life athletes, police officers, army military staff, who were called in on an open casting call because Amazons were required. So these magnificent women who weren't trained actors were performing as Amazons on screen. And they had major bonding, lots of training sessions, lots and lots of, obviously, physical fitness, but also weapons training, and weapons they may not have been very familiar with. And as you see the film, you see these women fighting and demonstrating what terrific, formidable fighters they were. They work as an army. They work so well because they have been training together. It's just such an inspiring, empowering sight to see that aspect of the film. In terms of the plot, Diana, I think the screenwriter pretty much invented Diana's upbringing in ignorance of her parentage, because this again goes back to the comic book. Diana of the Amazons didn't exist from the Greek myth. She's only invented in the 1940s, so probably from the comic books. But I think it was important for Diana to prove herself to her elders, in this case her aunt and her mother, as well as prove her competence and her prowess, and then prove herself worthy in combat of having the skills that she was born in, and only then does she discover them.
The male lead character, Steve Trevor, played by Chris Pine, he crashes into the island on an old-fashioned airplane, and eventually he's able to convince them that he's not a bad guy. What's the next step after that, and how do they actually wind up going to London? What are some of those steps? And then, let's stop there. How do they actually leave the island, and then where do they go?
Well, Steve convinces certainly Diana of his essential purity and his moral soundness, but she is sufficiently intrigued by the world he mentions in passing to want to know more about it. And so when he admits, well, actually, we're at war. Well, who's at war? The world is at war. She knows instantly this is her mission. She has to go out and help save the world. And at some point, the idea that Ares is to blame comes into it. And I cannot remember now how the plot integrates the mention of Ares and how Diana becomes aware of his existence and the fact that he is the god of war. Therefore, she has to go combat him. So she decides, I have to go. And she knows she's going to go against her mother's wishes. But that's not important because she's come in. She feels she has come into her destiny. She feels that this is what she was born for. This is what she was brought up to be a great fighter for. So she goes to the temple and she takes the weapons that she needs, which she has been told as a child she wasn't allowed to take because they wouldn't be for her. And then they get in a boat, a tiny little boat. There's a final conversation with her mother and they part in peace, possibly never seeing each other again, but I think that's actually very unlikely. And she and Steve sail off through the barrier. But where? This is the strange thing. Themyscira doesn't exist. It's floating about in the sea. And yet, after a rather funny overnight scene, somehow they've arrived at the Thames the next morning. And as I say in my blog post, so that means they're probably in the Baltic, which makes no sense whatsoever. So the filmmakers have clearly compressed the journey. And they're really not interested in geography. It is important that Themyscira is somewhere in the Mediterranean because Steve had to fly from where he was escaping from the German base Little planes like that didn't have much range, so he was probably flying from Turkey because there was a Turkish base with lots of Turkish soldiers. So he either went to the Adriatic or the Med. But then that would take him weeks to get round in that tiny boat all the way round the Straits of Gibraltar, up past France and into the Thames. It's complete nonsense. So I don't think we should dwell too much on that ridiculous premise.
And now, a brief word from our sponsors. I liked the way they balanced Diana, who was very new to the world and naive, with the really hard-edged character of Steve Trevor. I thought that they played off of each other very well.
Well, I don't know. Let me think. Hard-edged is not a phrase I would have thought of using of Steve Trevor. He's a bit cocky.
Yeah.
He's certainly an experienced soldier, and clearly he's a spy. I thought his haircut did him no favours, because it's a very 2017 haircut. It's not a First World War era haircut at all, and it's definitely not a haircut of a military man. So, to me, he just looked like slightly glamorous male lead planted into a film, and it was important that he still looked like Chris Pine we can see on the street. There was no effort to make him a character actor, unlike many of the other actors in the film. It was just hero lead, and it was, I can't really be bothered with Chris Pine. It doesn't interest me as an actor, and he played the part reasonably well, but the funny bits were good. I enjoyed the funny bits, and he was good at expressing severe embarrassment, not really quite understanding how a woman of the very early 20th century could not understand some things and knew far too much than she ought to do about other things. Those aspects, it was okay, but I didn't think he was that great, really.
That does lead us into an interesting theme of the movie, is that Diana's the fish out of water, where she does not know the social responsibilities and the social constraints on women at the time. What were some of the constraints that a woman might find herself in early 20th century England?
Well, she arrives in London wearing a long black cloak and a very short leather skirt and a leather breastplate. And her hair is down. Well, the hair, as an unmarried woman, her hair should have been down, fine, but she ought to have been wearing high-necked, long-sleeved, ankle-length garments, because that's what people wore in 1918, well, women wore. So we have this fantastic scene in a dress shop where she is led by Lucy Davis, who is the secretary of Chris Pine, Steve Trevor, and she tries on these clothes openly in public view was incorrect, but certainly to try them on in a dress shop was correct, and the eventual outfit that she chose was not too bad. But other things like walking around with a sword, clearly that's ridiculous. She simply wouldn't have been allowed to wear the sword. It would have been taken off her. And stopping and talking to people without being introduced, barging into the room of military officers and politicians, just assuming that she could go wherever she liked and she would be heard when she spoke, because she was used to being regarded with respect and to have her voice listened to. None of that would have been normal for a real woman of the early 20th century.
Yeah, that scene, there's a scene where there's a war council with very high-ranking generals.
Absolutely, yeah.
And there's probably a very little chance that the Steve Trevor character would have been involved directly in that meeting. He probably would have been debriefed, and somebody much higher up the ranks would have been involved in that meeting. So for her to have gone into that meeting is absurd, really, on the face of it.
Yeah, it
even
is.
Beyond that she was a woman, that who was she to even be probably in that building?
Well, she might have been allowed in as a secretary, possibly, or a typist, a stenographer, but certainly not to have a voice of any kind.
Maybe tell us a little bit about what was the situation of World War I at that point, give or take, in that's where the movie is set. What's happening at that point?
Well, what time of year are we? It's 1918, so we're coming up, well, let me get this right. I don't really know what month in 1918 the film is set. I think it's probably towards the beginning of autumn, because the weather is not lovely. It's wet and cold in Belgium. Therefore, let's assume it's August, September, a bad summer. Pretty much all the countries involved in the war knew that the end was coming, and it really just was a matter of time. It was up to the politicians to try and come to an agreement, and for the Kaiser and his leading generals to agree that surrender was necessary. It was an economic surrender rather than a military surrender. The military war had been won by the Allies, that is Britain and France and the United States. But the economic power of Germany suffering such crushing deprivations at home because it simply was not coping well enough with its own starving population and with the terrible loss of morale as the soldiers who were coming back from the front in such appalling physical shape. All this was leading to defeat at home, if you like. And I think that's really as much as I know. I'm not too hot on the end of the First World War. I'm better at the beginning of it, really. I was not slightly, I mean, there's no point even taking the film to be an accurate historical reenactment because it isn't. It's just fantasy for all sorts of reasons. But there is a lot of elements of daily life in London that were simply ignored. Rationing had been in full swing. There would have been an awful lot more wounded soldiers walking around. There would have been an awful lot more women in mourning. In fact, most people would have been in black wearing mourning, certainly by 1918. This did not seem to come across in the very brief street scenes we saw. And as for Diana trying on clothes in a dress shop that were full of colours, even that is a little, I don't know, it doesn't really reflect how I imagine a dress shop might have looked at the very end of the war. Would those fabrics and garments have been on sale? I mean, we had a blockade. Rationing was not just for food, it was for garments as well. And yet when they got to Belgium, that was suddenly a lot more plausible. The language aspect was very interesting. Diana can speak many languages, and that was such a good point in the military meeting where she was able to interpret these written documents without even thinking because she knows so many languages. And then we see this again. She talks to the group of Steve's friends in their different languages, and that's entertaining and fun. And then she goes to Belgium and she speaks to a Flemish woman in Dutch. And it was allowed to be in Dutch during the film, which really impressed me, because all too often when you get a war film set in a country that doesn't have English as its first language, the foreign characters have to speak English with a bad accent to prove that A, they're foreign, but also so the American and British viewers can watch them. But there was a woman speaking Flemish, and I happened to know a bit of Dutch, so I could understand what she said. And Diana's response was in perfect Flemish. And then we got to a different part of the area, and another Belgian spoke with a French accent to show that he was an educated man who could speak English, but his accent showed he was Belgian. Little things like that worked very well for me. Other elements simply weren't done properly, so it was kind of patchy. But the language bit, I'm still really interested in the way they managed to get that in and not get it wiped out.
Yeah, that was really a powerful part of the movie. And then zooming a bit forward into that actual World War I battle, did that represent a real battle during World War I?
I don't think there was enough artillery being used. You mean the moment where Diana climbs the ladder and starts running across through no man's land? First, I want to know where her grey costume went. She had a skirt, a jacket and a blouse on. Suddenly, she whips them off and I don't know what happens, and presumably she's wearing her superhero uniform underneath. Fine. So she runs across and then kneels and uses her shield to protect her from machine gun fire. So machine gun fire is absolutely correct. It was used. There should have been a great deal more crossfire, and there also should have been artillery shells landing near her somewhere, but there just didn't seem to be enough. And for her to receive all the fire, taking the fire so the guys behind her can run up, that was strategically correct. That is how the soldiers were expected to work. So take the fire, make a dash, and then carry on. And clearly the magic powers of her shield and her impermeability to bullets, all this worked very well. So I think there should have been more, but on the whole it was pretty correct. As far as I know, I am not a military historian.
When they actually take that town in Belgium, what was it like for places that were close to the front lines
Oh,
during World War One.
They got smashed to bits. It's just horrific. Belgium, I lived in Belgium for 16 years, so I know a fair bit about how that part of northwest Europe suffered during not just the First World War, but the Second, and also the wars before that in the 19th century. The buildings in Flanders and the French part of Flanders, which is it's where the border runs through, they just got smashed to bits. Even now, it's very rare to see a building dating from before the 1950s in that part of the world, except when you've got wholesale reconstruction. The town of Ypres, Ypres, which is very famous in the First World War, it was completely demolished during the war and was rebuilt completely after the war, and then got demolished again in the Second World War, and then got rebuilt. So now you can go to Ypres as a tourist to visit the battlefield cemeteries and the Great War Museum there, and the place looks like it might well have looked at the beginning of the 20th century, but it's been completely rebuilt. You go into the smaller areas, the small villages, many houses are, I'd say most of the buildings date from the 50s and 60s. Occasionally you see a farmhouse which managed to survive, but even that has probably been rebuilt. So it was wholesale demolition in the trench areas, whereas the city of Brussels and the larger cities, which were under German occupation and were not such important military targets, did not have the same amount of battery.
They portray one of the major generals of the German side, General Ludendorff. He's one of the real bad guys of the movie. And it's pretty clear that he's not represented as a real historical character. Maybe tell us a little bit about General Ludendorff and how somebody like that is archetypal in this sort of comic book concept.
Well, I know nothing about the real General Ludendorff, other than he was an important and well-respected German military commander. But the Ludendorff we see in the film, he is archetypal as a villain because he's big, he's physically big, and he wears a big swooshing greatcoat. He is a bully. He is free to kill anyone he feels like, which is a way to move him from being human to being a monster. So we are invited to look forward to his defeat in almost any way possible. He is controlling a secret scientific mission which is going to produce a poison gas. So this immediately associates him with the horrendous gas attacks during the First World War, which the Germans initiated, but I think the British also did perpetrate too. So he's associated with key elements of really, really bad behaviour, if you like. That's putting it very limply. He's not a personality we are invited to see as a nuanced character. He's just given labels and tags which tell us how bad he is by his behaviour.
We do learn, though, that he's not the exact bad guy in the movie who is Ares. We were kind of led to think that he is Ares, the god of war, who Diana's supposed to fight.
Yeah.
But there's a little twist in there. Who is Ares after all?
Well, and this is a big spoiler, Ares is David Thewlis. And those of us who have watched the Harry Potter films would be a bit worried because David Thewlis plays a very sympathetic character in the Harry Potter films. But if you've watched Thewlis's career, he is an actor who specialises in playing characters who are dangerous, who are edgy, who are very challenging in many ways. So in a way, the Harry Potter role was actually out of character from his usual run of roles. So for him to play Ares, that's a very interesting casting decision. And I think in his first disguise, when he is a politician, he's actually perfectly cast because he has the right kind of face and the right moustache to look like an early 20th century politician. And he walks with a stick, so he is sympathetic, he has a disability, and he seems to be sympathetic to Diana's mission. He allows them to make their way to France, or to Belgium, without being stopped by the military. So all this is a wonderful red herring, and it's really a classic diversionary tactic. The man or the character you are invited to feel warmly towards because he's helping the heroes turns out to be the enemy, because he's deliberately shepherding the heroes towards a big showdown with Ludendorff, so that Ares' aim of finding a way for the secret poison weapon to be used can be realized. He's making the heroes do his work for him. So this element of devious strategy is something we don't expect, because Ares, the god of war, if you take it straight from the Greek myth, he's just this gigantic muscle with weapons. He doesn't have nuance. He doesn't have much intelligence. He's just a figurehead of war. So to have the deviousness as well, that was very clever.
Yeah, didn't he represent the brutality of war, not necessarily the strategy or
That's
the...
exactly right, yeah. War as a violent way of killing people, rather than war as a tactic and a strategy, as you say.
Now, this is the part where you've brought something really interesting to the table that really hasn't been explored before, but it's almost too much to be coincidental. Tell us a little bit about this early 20th century adventure writer, John Buchanan, and maybe where some of these parallels start to come up between his novels and this screenplay.
Well, it was very interesting, because as I was watching, I was thinking, I know this. I've seen that before. Elements from the plot when they're in London just jumped out at me. So to give you background, I spent about 20 years of my working life researching and studying the writing of John Buchanan, who was a Scottish novelist, and he had many other roles, but the works he is most famous for, beginning with the 39 Steps and the 3 sequels, feature a character called Richard Hannay. Now, the 39 Steps has been subsequently filmed 3 times, the first time by Alfred Hitchcock, but that was in 1935. During the First World War, Buchanan published The 39 Steps in 1915, the sequel called Green Mantle in 1916, and then a third novel in 1919, but he wrote it at the end of the war in 1918, called Mr. Standfast. There is also a post-war novel, but that's not relevant here. So these 3 novels are written really very close together. At the same time, Buchanan is working as a journalist, as a military correspondent, and also he becomes Director of Information for the government. So he was a propagandist, if you like. And that's really enough to know for now. Now, the point is, Steve goes into this military meeting as a low-ranking but important spy with crucial information, and Diana follows him. This scene also occurs at the end of the 39 Steps, when Hannay goes into a meeting as a very low-ranking and junior person out of nowhere with secret crucial information that will allow the secret plot to be discovered and the novel to find its resolution. So that was interesting. And then we have Steve gathering a group of trusty colleagues in a bar, and Diana joins them because they're going to go on a secret mission behind the front, behind the trenches. This happens in Buchanan's novel Green Mantle, and even down to the fact that they wear German disguises, and they go to Constantinople to find out what the secret is it's brewing to do with the forces of the Ottoman Empire. Now, in the novel, they do go to Constantinople because Buchanan wanted a Turkish setting for the excitement and the glamour and the way his plot was going to work out. In the film, we have Turkish soldiers at the beginning of the film, who Steve Trevor flies away from, but also we have a Turkish character. So you've got some elements of the Buchanan plot in there as well, but it's the idea of gathering together a group of colleagues to go on a mission, and then you go to the trenches. And then most interesting of all, what they're fighting against is a German plot to create a poison gas, secretly, which will be released on the Allied forces. This is in Mr. Standfast. It's exactly the same plot. It's deployed on the eve of the armistice. The hero spots the woman, and it is a woman. That's also the strange thing. There's an old woman in a farmyard working with the gas. And this is happening, and it's a young woman, it's happening in the film too. It is as if the script writers for Wonder Woman had read all the John Buchanan novels to do with the First World War and boiled up the good bits to make their plot. Nobody else has noticed this, as far as I'm aware. And actually, it could be debated in many ways, but if it should come to pass, I would so like to discuss this with the screenwriters, because I think this is so many remarkable coincidences from one body of work. I don't think it is a coincidence. I think they genuinely lifted elements of Buchan's writing and put it in the plot of Wonder Woman.
And now, a brief word from our sponsors. How popular were his novels at the time in the early 20th century, the 19 teens and 20s?
Well, The 39 Steps was the novel that made Buchan's name. Before that, he'd been a jobbing novelist, if you like. He'd written a great deal, he'd done many things, but he'd never settled. It wasn't until The 39 Steps was published and became a word-of-mouth hit that he was able to write longer novels and write more novels and basically become a novelist rather than do other things to earn his living. Green Mantle, the sequel, that was actually a bigger hit at the time. And for many years, Buchan was known as the author of Green Mantle. But it wasn't until the Hitchcock movie that The 39 Steps became the novel by which he is basically remembered today. But it was, both of them were huge bestsellers, and Mr. Standfast, a really important bestseller. Buchan was selling novels at a level for which perhaps Conan Doyle in his day had been selling. He was a household name. He wrote a novel every other year and a biography or a history book in the years in between. He was prolific, very impressively prolific compared to if you consider what else he was doing in his life, which was a great deal. He was a very, very popular author.
How have his novels stood the test of time? Are they common in the literary world? Do people know of these novels? Are they studied?
Yeah, Buchan is known. He's very often sneered at because he is not considered to be important from a literary perspective. But he is still read in Scotland. The 39 Steps and one of his other novels, which is a Scottish setting, these are on the Scottish curriculum. So children read them as a matter of course in their education. Buchan came out of copyright a few years ago, and suddenly about 5 or 6 separate publishers went on a binge of reprinting all his fiction. Not his non-fiction, that is much less popular, but his fiction sells, and publishers know this. And when it comes down to money, if you know that the book is going to make money, it doesn't matter what you think of the author, you get the book published.
Were his books at the time considered literary, or were they more of a potboiler type bestseller novel?
They weren't lowbrow at all. Neither were they highbrow. They were not experimental and modernist. They were not challenging in the sense that they deployed new ways of telling a story or explored areas that were considered taboo. He didn't work in that kind of field. He wrote adventure. He wrote romance with a small r, the romance novel, in the way that Robert Louis Stevenson and Sir Walter Scott wrote romance novels. He wrote novels about chases, about secrets to be discovered, about wild and exotic adventures. But with his feet on the ground, the characters are very human, very normal. They have human emotions. They have very, very attractive features. But it's the way he did it. He was a born storyteller, and that really is what sells his books. When you read a John Buchan novel, or even his short stories too, you will be told a wonderful story, and you will enjoy it immensely.
I think we have to share the rest of the story about his life, because he didn't live the life of your average novelist, did he?
Certainly didn't know. Which bit are you thinking of that needs revealing?
I mean, really, his whole life was a lot of high adventure, but maybe towards the end of his life, especially when he was writing these novels and later in his career.
Well, high adventure, I think it depends on what you define as adventure. I'll start from the beginning and just whiz through the high points. So he went to Oxford. He published his first novel before he went to Oxford as an undergraduate. After Oxford, he became a lawyer. He read for the bar. And then he became a civil servant. He worked in South Africa after the Boer War in a fairly dubious area of resettling land. And that's an area where there's some controversy about his exact role. But he was working for the British government, so he was a civil servant. He came back to London. He worked as a journalist and a reviewer. He became a publisher. At the beginning of the First World War, he became a journalist again, as I've said. He ended up the war as director of information. He went back to publishing. He became a deputy director of Reuters. And then he became a member of Parliament. He was elected in 1927, and then he was moving in high political circles. He was a trusted advisor to both to prime ministers on both sides of the political divide because he was such a useful man to know. He was a fixer, a networker, and a man of great knowledge. And all this time he is writing several books a year, and most of them sold extremely well. And then in 1935, he was invited by the King, George V, to become Governor General of Canada. So he was ennobled, he became Lord Tweedsmuir. He sailed to Canada with his wife, and for the next 5 years, he was the King's High Representative in Canada, representing the Crown, and working closely and very diplomatically with the Canadian government and their Prime Minister, Mackenzie King. And he died in 1940. He had a brain hemorrhage, fell over, cracked his head on a basin, and died in hospital a few days later, and had a state funeral. He had signed Canada's entry into the Second World War. His 2 elder sons were in uniform when he died. He should have lived longer. It was a great accident that he did die, but the body was... He had a lot of ill health. He had a terrible stomach complaint that dogged him most of his working life. So the fact that he managed to do so much is truly remarkable.
How does this movie wrap up? You've shown that this really does mirror the books of John Buchan very closely. How does the movie Wonder Woman end?
Well, the movie ends with Diana and Steve and their cohort of friends getting to a summit. There is apparently a summit which, and again, the geography is terribly strange, because if they've sailed to France and they've crossed to the trenches and they're in Belgium, but probably the western half of Belgium, suddenly they manage to get to a summit, which must be about 100 miles away. Not very far, not very far away in time. And it's a summit at which German civilians are arriving in evening clothes, which simply makes no sense whatsoever. There is a very marvellous moment where a grumpy German lady wearing a lovely blue dress gets so fed up of waiting in a queue for the summit, because it's an evening party as well as a meeting, that she gets out of her car and walks past Diana, who's hiding in a forest, and Diana looks her up and down. Next scene we see Diana is wearing that dress, entering the party, and we don't know what happened to the German lady. I expect she didn't live very much longer. So there is this meeting, this large glamorous party, and there's a political meeting at the same time. And this is where Diana tries to attack Ludendorff and is led off, distracted away to try and finish him off. And she does kill him, but then Ares descends. And this is the really ridiculous part. It's the reviews I've heard and listened to and read pretty much all say the last half hour of the film is a mistake, because the CG people are allowed to do anything they want, and they do some ridiculous things. So Ares is depicted in full armour, still with his moustache, which really doesn't work. And there is a huge firework fight, which now seems to be the tradition for most superhero films, that the evil alien or the villain and the hero will have a showdown with spectacular fireworks and explosions. And it really doesn't matter about the humans who get crushed underneath the gigantic breaking concrete and metal structures. It's just overkill. And it's a shame, because it spoils the subtleties and the cleverness and the nuance that the rest of the film does manage to achieve. We relapse into fireworks for boys, and it's just a bit tedious, really. Anyway, there's a showdown, and there's a really big spoiler at the end I'm not going to discuss because that would be a shame. But Diana does vanquish Ares, and we see her at the end of the film back in the modern times.
What are your takeaways from this movie? What do you think of it in the end?
I loved it. I loved it so much. I really want to go and see it again, but it's sadly left the cinema near me, so I'm going to have to find a different cinema or wait for it to come out on DVD. I thought it was, apart from the last half hour and apart from a dodgy 30-second blast of really poor CG in one of the trench scenes, I thought it was magnificent in almost every way. I would have preferred a different leading man for Steve Trevor, but never mind. Gal Gadot is marvellous, an absolute wonder in this film. Lucy Davis is so good as the comic secretary who grounds Diana's naivety and eases her into British society. The Amazons are simply tremendous. The war scenes are extremely creditably done. given the fact that you've got a superhero wandering in out of the trenches. You just don't think about the realism. But still, it's just tremendous. I really can't recommend it high enough, apart from the last half hour.
Yeah, they really did seem to, the CGI bit seemed to be an afterthought or just something that they had to throw in there.
I think it's something they felt they had to, yeah. Really not necessary.
For a story that was really a concise story, it almost took away from the story.
Exactly, yeah. It's a pity. It's as if the marketing people decided we need this because all superhero films have this. And for that, the Marvel universe is probably to blame, because all the Marvel superhero films end with a colossal, earth-shattering, epic, fireworky thing, and perhaps DC felt they had to do the same, but it is a pity. They should have had the courage of their convictions and continued the film to its end, following the same themes, the same tone, and not diverging in this annoying way.
Thank you for listening to Beyond the Big Screen podcast. Of course, a really big thanks goes out to Kate MacDonald of the Why I Really Like This Book podcast and blog, as well as a literary blog, katemacdonald.net. Links to learn more about Kate can be found at katemacdonald.net or in the show notes. She is also the head of the Handheld Press, where Kate would love to hear your ideas for books that should be reprinted. You can find links to all of these things in the show notes. If you would like to learn more about Beyond the Big Screen, see show notes and connect to the social media, go over to a2zhistorypage.com. I would love to hear from you. As I said, we can talk movies, and I would definitely like to hear your ideas for future show topics. Feel free to email me anytime at steve@a2zhistorypage.com. If you like what you hear, I would really appreciate you leaving the show a rating and review on iTunes. iTunes reviews also let other people find out about the show, so it's a win-win for everybody. And of course, we will see you next time beyond the big screen.